You're listening to the Potaholics Comedy Network. Potaholics.com.
Welcome to Codex, a history of video games. My name is Tyler Osby.
And I'm Mike Coletta.
And this week, on episode 22, we are covering chapter 27 of The Ultimate History of Video Games by Stephen L. Kent. This chapter is called The Next Generation Part 2, which is very helpful for us because we did Part 1 last week. It's a nice little divider. Makes it easy for us.
Yeah, it'd be really weird if they did a part 1.
So what's going on in... Yeah.
And then they didn't do a part 2. That would weird me out.
Yeah. It's like the Mel Brooks movie, History of the World, Part 1. There's no Part 2.
Oh, yeah. It confused me as a child.
I looked that guy up. I was like, that guy had to have made something recently, right? He's 92.
Oh, yeah. Mel Brooks is really old.
He's super old.
He's
this
amazing.
Week on Super Old Directors.
Welcome back to Super Old Dudes with Tyler Osby and Mike Coletta.
Yeah. Mel Brooks, I was like, man, I bet that guy's like mid-60s, late 60s. Nope. Definitely 92.
He's so amazing, though. And it's so funny because his movies are so inappropriate. But my mom let me watch Blazing Saddles when I was like 10. And I'm like, this movie is not meant for kids at all. Okay, sorry. Distractions.
So the last movie that Mel Brooks directed was in, I believe, 1995. Mike, what else was happening in 1995?
Ooh, solid segue. So
Thanks.
Now today we're talking about the lead up to the consoles we all know and love. Starting. Like, we love the SNES and the Sega Genesis, obviously, but we're getting into a more modern age. So as of 1995, it's important to note that the console video game industry was on a downturn.
Oh, no.
Mm-hmm, indeed. Very scary.
We're not talking like 1982 levels, though. We're talking
it's starting to decline and people are getting nervous. So according to the NPD Group, which is a toy market tracking company, very specific niche, I think, in 1993, the U.S. console market netted $4.4 billion. A lot of money, okay?
So, yep, big
bucks.
By
1995, it was down to $3.07 billion. Oh, no, still a lot of money, but a whole $1 billion lower.
But when it's less, that's scary because it means next year could be even less. And then if that continues, eventually you are down to $0 billion. And that's not desirable.
That is not gangbusters.
Right.
That is pretty bad.
Not hotcakes.
That's right. So in 1994, if you want a percentage drop, it was a 17% drop. And then in 1995, it was a 19% drop. So they're like, oh, no. Sega was also $700 million in debt and had 25% control of the world market in 1995, while Nintendo had 70% of the market and no debt. And you're like, hey, why was Sega in debt? That seems really weird. Well, Sega was in debt because they were the ones that were dropping the price of the Genesis. If you remember, like it was like $149 and then $129 and then $99. And they were not making a profit on the Genesis console. Meanwhile, Nintendo was always making a profit on the consoles and games they sold. So,
they always do. That's Nintendo's deal. Right. They always make a profit.
Nintendo was always going for it. And Atari and 3DO at the time had it the worst. They pretty much had no consumer base between the two of them. This is officially when they were kind of like, oh, we're done. So Atari and 3DO are pretty much done. The arcade business, I should also mention, was not in good shape. It kind of had a boost from the Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat era, but Taito closed their U.S. offices in 1995, and Data East, big company in arcades, sold its pinball division to Sega of America in 1995.
Not looking great.
Not looking great. Here. Pretty bad. So another important thing to note that happened is there was a trade show battle.
Because we're still in CES era at this point, right?
Yeah, everyone is still showing stuff off at the Consumer Electronics Show, or CES, and that one had a summer and a winter CES. But now that because of the Mortal Kombat case we talked about at the Senate hearing, there is representation for the video game industry as a whole in the Interactive Digital Software Association. They were created following that Senate investigation about Mortal Kombat, and they decided, hey, we need our own show. So CES is like, okay, what we can do is we're run by a parent company called the Electronic Industry Association, and they offer to do a show called CESI, the I standing for interactive. But
like a separate CES that's still CES, but just for interactive things, namely video games, right?
yeah, so you don't have like refrigerators, unless they're interactive refrigerators, which I
Hey,
would like a refrigerator to talk to me personally.
I saw that episode of Silicon Valley.
That's right. So, and Nintendo and Microsoft were the ones that liked CESI. They're like, we'll do that. But every other video game company wanted another option from a large international publishing company called IDG Communications. They wanted to create their own show called the Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3. Now, if you follow video games at all, you will know that E3 won. They won that battle. And Nintendo fought for CES, but eventually they're like, hey, if we want to compete with all our competitors, we have to go to the show that they're all going to, and that was E3. So E3 won out, and that would now be the new battleground for future console wars.
There's just not enough room in this world for more than one, like, trade show.
Yeah.
There's just one, and that's where everybody's got to show their stuff. There's a lot of different video game conventions, like Penny Arcade Expo, and like Comic-Con kind of has a lot of game stuff these days and things like that. But like when it comes to just showing off your latest wares, if you're a hardware manufacturer or game manufacturer, E3 is the place to do it.
Yeah, you want to be at E3. E3 is definitely like this is the new thing, and it's kind of bringing us into the modern era, as I was saying before. Like, this is very important for us. Mm-hmm. So the next thing I want to talk about is Sega Saturn.
Ooh.
And Sega Saturn was released in Japan. It's their 32-bit console on November 22nd, 1994, and the launch was on a Tuesday, which, if you remember, the NES, it broke Japan when it was released. Or the SNES.
And they were like, please only do this on the weekends from now on.
Yeah, and Saturn was like, no. Sega Saturn's like, we're coming out now. We can't wait for it. And
it's also... Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. What's important? Tell me.
I was going to say, it's also important to note that this was one of Sega's 32-bit consoles, which didn't help them in their marketing problems.
Oh, yeah, we're going to bring that up in a bit. So Sega initially shipped 200,000 consoles, Sega Saturn consoles, sold for 44,800 yen, which is around $469 US. And
That's
almost...
spendy.
Yeah, it was a pricey console.
Especially back in that day, like $469 and $95, $94.
Oh, yeah, that's a lot of money. So
probably $600 or $700.
Yeah.
Today. Yeah.
And almost all the stores sold out their inventory in advance with pre-sales. They did have some for sale on a first-come, first-served basis, but this was huge lines, and they sold out. And while the Saturn was not bundled with any games, the star game of the Sega Saturn was Virtua Fighter.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and Virtua Fighter, if you don't know, was created by Sega's very famous internal dev team, AM2, led by Yu Suzuki. And he was initially Sega's Shigeru Miyamoto, essentially. He was this guy is making games for Sega, like he's our guy. And he was known for some famous arcade games he created, including Space Harrier, Hang On, Outrun, and Virtua Racing. Virtua Racing was very popular. But Virtua Fighter was a hit because it used 3D polygonal graphics, and it had a variety of real-life fighting styles like Kung Fu and pro wrestling. So it was actually trying to be kind of realistic in this fantasy setting, which...
That's kind of cool, though. I mean, I appreciate that, especially as you get into the 3D era and things are starting to get more realistic, or at least they're trying to tout them as more realistic. That's one way to do it.
Yeah, definitely. And it's actually kind of matches Suzuki's personality. He was kind of known as an eccentric. Like, he drove a Ferrari to work, and he liked fine wines, and his games were always kind of a mixture of realism and fantasy. And he loved to use new technologies. Like, he would use a lot of force feedback rumble controllers in Virtua Racing. So the steering wheel would shake on the arcade version of the game. And it also used 3D polygonal graphics, which is kind of... I mean, this is the beginning of what video games look like now, essentially.
Yeah.
But he wasn't the first to use 3D polygonal graphics. He actually took the idea from a 1984 Atari game designed by David Thur called I, Robot.
Based on the book?
I believe so. The Isaac Asimov, yeah.
I love that book.
Yeah, it's great. So Virtua Racing was such an arcade hit that he wanted to use the same graphic style with Virtua Fighter. And while the characters weren't as detailed as like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, like you couldn't see their faces as well, the 3D graphics made it so it was just so smooth. Just a buttery smooth game. you know?
And the 3D graphics themselves are kind of like a novelty, right? Like, so the super realistic things that, or like the nice hand-drawn things of Street Fighter, the super realistic things of Mortal Kombat, those are like cool niches. But then also, like, just back in the day, 3D graphics was like its own, like even low poly was kind of its own art style that was like, that was cool in and of itself, right?
Oh, yeah. It was definitely like, this is the thing. This is why you're buying this game, is because it just looks so crazy compared to other games. And Virtua Fighter for Saturn was the exact same game as the arcade version, which is kind of, I mean, we've talked about it before, but ports for consoles were not always the same as the arcade. Usually they were worse. Because
that's the dream, is that it's the, like, that was, the advertising was always like arcade in your home, and nobody had ever really hit it until this era, probably.
Yeah, and it sold. The game was such a, like, they knew what, they had a good product, so it sold for 7,800 yen, which is $80 US. Yeah, in 1995. So that's definitely more in today's money if you want to look
People
it up.
talk about how games are expensive today, but they really haven't changed that much in price, or they've gone down since back in the day. Like, I paid $70 for my copy of Ocarina of Time, and that was $1998. Like, so when people are like, I don't want to pay $60 plus a season pass today, I'm like, well, I don't know, man.
It's pretty.
Games cost a lot of money to make.
Kind of cheaper, yeah. I mean, there's more
Yeah,
competition
it's cheaper
now too.
Games are cheaper now.
So Virtua Fighter CD, that's what the game was called for Saturn. It sold at a nearly 1-to-1 ratio with Saturn consoles. So while it wasn't bundled with the Saturn, everyone wanted Virtua Fighter. That was the game to buy.
Yeah.
And it's also important to note that also in 1994, on December 3rd, the Sony PlayStation came out in Japan.
Ooh.
It was on December 3rd, 1994. And Sony was not an established game company, so they only shipped 100,000 consoles at a price of 39,800 yen. And unlike Sega, they had no pre-orders. And so most people were able to just go to the store the day they came out and like, I just want a PlayStation, and there you go. So they also were not making games yet, really. So their most popular title was Ridge Racer, which is a game I do remember. And it was actually an arcade game that came out. And it was published by Namco. So that was the game that you wanted to get with the Sony PlayStation when it came out. I don't think it was bundled with it. I think that's just the game that you wanted, you know? And the Sony PlayStation was designed by Ken Kutaragi, and the console itself ended up looking way different than the original design, because as you recall, the original design was a Super NES CD-ROM console. Remember, there was that whole thing with Nintendo bailing out on Sony, which is kind of what started this whole thing. We wouldn't really have PlayStation if Nintendo didn't screw over Sony.
Yeah, yep. And
So,
they went to Philips and made nothing.
Yeah.
Well, not nothing, but nothing of note.
Yeah, nothing of note. And the final version was designed around a 32-bit R3000A RISC chip, and this was supposed to be able to render 500,000 texture-mapped polygons a second. But in the end, it ended up doing about 350,000, which is still a lot, but I think it was technically a more powerful console than the Saturn, which we'll get to a little bit later. But
It was easier to develop for as well.
Yeah, that's right. So the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation were they had similar capabilities, but were different in how they were designed and how they were marketed. So the PlayStation had a single processing chip with a 3D geometry engine, and along with development tools that Sony made available to anyone to program games. So that, along with its $10 licensing fee, if you got the licensing fee, you got these development tools, and that's so cheap. A $10 licensing fee per game made devs want to design games for the PlayStation. They got a lot of people in. Nearly 100 companies signed licensing agreements with Sony by the time the PlayStation was going to launch in the US, and more than 300 individual game projects were planned or underway when it was about to launch in the US. So
wow. So they launched it, but they didn't have a whole lot of things at launch, but they did have like lots of stuff in the works.
Yeah, they had a lot of things in the work. And it's important to note with Sony and the PlayStation that Sony before this point had a very bad history with video games. So up until that point, Sony Interactive was small and was fairly unsuccessful. They had one good game with Mickey Mania, which is Disney-based, for the SNES, Genesis, and Sega CD. But other than that, they were usually pretty much torn apart by critics. Their ESPN sports simulation games were considered to be some of the worst on the market at the time. And then they decided, they're like, well, we got to help people, like, we got to get someone to help us design games. So then they decided to spend $48 million and buy a Liverpool-based company called Psygnosis. It's Psygnosis.
I think it's Psygnosis. Yeah.
Psygnosis? Okay, like diagnosis. And
Yeah.
Psygnosis' one-hit game they made was called Lemmings, but the problem was that game was not designed by Psygnosis. It was designed by outside developers and published by Psygnosis. So the whole the buyout seemed really weird. It just seemed like you're buying a publishing company, not a game design company. So it seemed it was an odd choice.
Yeah.
And marketing-wise, Sony Computer Entertainment of America knew, and this is now the American company they've created, Sony Computer Entertainment of America. If you actually turn on a PlayStation for, I think, a PS1 or a PS2, or I think PS3, it says Sony Computer Entertainment of America. It doesn't just say Sony. And
Yeah.
they knew they had their work cut out for them, which is why they hired a very top-notch staff. The president was Steve Race, and he had been he had been the VP of Atari's European division before the game crash in the heyday of the 2600. And after the crash, him and several other vets founded a little company called Worlds of Wonder, which we've talked about before. And they were the ones that designed Teddy Ruxpin, and they helped market the NES in America. They're the ones that helped break it into the U.S. market. Now,
But he knows what's up. He's been around the block.
He's been around the block. He knows a lot, and he knows how to market games, which is the most important part about this whole thing, because at the time, like, they got to break in now, and they got to go up against Sega, and they got to go up against Nintendo. So this is like their dream team they've created. And the next person on the dream team, the PlayStation dream team, was their senior vice president, Jim Wims, and he was also an ex-World of Wonder executive who had a long history with video game companies like iMagic and Data East, the company I just mentioned before, the pinball company.
Mm-hmm.
And he was known as a tall, strong leadership type. That's what he was described in the book. He's like, this guy's a natural leader, and he's going to take us there. So the most interesting person, though, I found on the whole lineup was this guy. And he was the third-party relations person, and his name was Bernie Stoller. And he started all the way back with Marty Bromley and David Rosen, so a long time ago.
He's been around the block as well.
Oh, yeah, he's definitely been around the block. And he was the head of an arcade company called Game Plan that made a 1981 game called Shark Attack, which is kind of, to show his like business savvy, this is what they talked about in the book. To get around licensing disputes with Universal and Jaws, he made a deal with Sid Sheinberg, who was the head of Universal at the time, that he would not pay royalties on the first 1,000 Shark Attack machines. And after that, hey, Sid Sheinberg and Universal can charge him royalties. To get around this, though, Stoller only manufactured 990 machines. Which was kind of like a big...
he was worried that he was going to get sued, or he had sort of reached a deal to make sure he didn't get sued or something?
Yeah, essentially. He's like, I don't want to get sued, so I made this cool marketing deal where the first 1,000, it's like, hey, you won't get in trouble for using Shark Attack, which is essentially Jaws. But then after that, you have to pay Universal. And he's like, okay, well then I'll only make 990 machines. So Stoller was really good at his job, and he managed to get a 6-month exclusivity contract with Williams for Mortal Kombat 3, so it would only be on the PlayStation for the first 6 months the game came out. And he knew this would work because...
That's a good pickup.
Yeah, Mortal Kombat had a crazy cult following at this point. People that played it on arcades love it, and they want to play it on their home console. So this pretty much guarantees that people that love Mortal Kombat are going to buy a PlayStation. And the one downside is that Stoller did not really like RPGs, which is kind of a bummer. He didn't think they sold well in the U.S., which, as we know now, is a mistake. But that was his one kryptonite, okay? He didn't like RPGs.
Well, you can't know everything. Not everybody knows everything. In fact, nobody knows everything.
No one knows anything. It's just it's really the kryptonite of my heart because I love RPGs.
Yeah, me too.
That's why. I thought Stoller was going to be my best friend in this whole book. And now I'm like, oh, I love RPGs though. So the last person Race hired was Peter Johnson, and not a lot is known about him. He was hired to run marketing communications, but he was unfortunately killed in a plane crash in October of 1994.
Ooh,
so I don't
RIP.
know. Yeah, I don't know if they replaced him or not. It was pretty tragic though. It definitely slowed down the whole team. There's a part in the book where they're talking about it. He's like, I just had dinner with him, and it was the next day, and it's really, really sad. So
that's very sad.
Yeah, the one thing Race and his team did have going for them is they knew that the PlayStation was amazing. They're like, we have a great product, much like the NES. If you remember, like Hiroshi Yamauchi was like, this is the best machine and I'm confident in my product. They are very much like that at PlayStation as well. So the big problem they had was to break it into the US market. Mm-hmm. And the Sony Computer Entertainment of Japan executives were not being very helpful, and apparently they fought a lot. This is in the book. This
happens all the time between the American subsidiaries and the Japan ones. Like Nintendo of America always had problems with Nintendo Japan. Sega of America, man, Tom Kalinske always having trouble with Sega of Japan. And now Sony's got the same things going on.
Yeah.
That's a bar.
And it's definitely, they would fight over things like the price and then also the length of the controller cord. Which I was like, that's such a small detail. But when you think about it, you got to think about everything before it comes out. So,
yeah. I mean, somebody makes that decision. And I guess if there's a decision to be made, there's people who fight over it.
Yeah, I got to the point that people thought Race was going to be fired. But the ultimate test was going to be how Sony would act at this upcoming E3 show. And I want to say, we are now talking this whole episode about leading up to this big E3 show in 1995. And we will tell you.
Because this is before the PlayStation was out in
America.
The United States.
This is before the PlayStation was out in America. We're about to talk about the Sega Saturn, which is coming out in America, and then Nintendo's debacle with the Ultra 64, which they. I believe you're going to get to that. So we'll talk. You'll talk about that in a bit. But I'm going to talk about Sega for a little bit because Sega, what are they doing with their next big U.S. release? So we mentioned before that Sega had a lot of systems, and this was a problem, and it led to a huge mistake. So Sega Enterprises CEO Hayao Nakayama, who we talked about before, he at the time and Sega were juggling support for 7 separate systems. They had the Sega Genesis, the Sega Game Gear, which is a handheld, the Sega Pico, which I don't think we discussed on here, and I don't think I've ever actually heard of or seen, but the Sega CD, the 32X, and the 32X CD. And now the Saturn. So they had all of those systems. And they're like, we got to make a choice. We got to focus on one. And Nakayama decided that he's like, I am going to focus, and Sega's going to exclusively focus on Saturn everywhere, including the United States. And Tom Kalinske completely disagreed with this decision. He thought that essentially you're still so much 16-bit business that they were now finally in control of. Like they felt like they had won that 16-bit console war. But now Nakayama,
let's capitalize on this.
Yeah, Nakayama's like, nope, we're going to look at the Saturn. And he didn't understand that looking at Saturn versus Genesis, he was looking at it from this perspective of the Japanese market, where the Sega Genesis never did well. It never did well in Japan. But in the US, that was the Sega system that everyone wanted.
This is the problem with the American subsidiaries not getting along with Japan, is it's like in America things might be different, and so they go to Japan and they're like, hey, things are actually okay here. If we just capitalize on these things that are working for us in America, then we can do great stuff. And in Japan they're just like, nope, didn't work in Japan, so I guess you're done.
Yeah, it's so crazy. They really it's definitely a thing that's come back before. It's one of those things. I feel like at the end of this, Tyler, we got to put a list together of, if you're going to start a video game company, the big no-nos, because looking back through history, there's a lot of no-nos. There's, you got to have games. You can't fight with the other country's version of your company. And so also what happened, that Japanese market thing was definitely a problem, and focusing only on the Saturn, that was the big problem. Another thing that really didn't help was there was a magazine in the US called Next Generation, and they decided, hey, we're going to do a side-by-side comparison of the Saturn and the PlayStation. And we're going to look at them. We're going to see which one we like. And guess what? The editorial staff definitely chose PlayStation. And they showed both. They actually opened up both consoles and showed them side by side. And we're like, this is what the Saturn looks like on the inside, and this is what the PlayStation looks like on the inside. And the PlayStation, very nice and neat. One processor on one board. Everything's all tidy. Meanwhile, the Saturn had wires everywhere and a daughter board, which held the CD-ROM controllers. So it looked really haphazardly thrown together. So if a person that doesn't know a lot about technology is reading and looking at these pictures in this magazine, they're going to think, oh, the Sega Saturn is like a shabby console. It's just put together poorly. It's kind of like when people I feel like Apple, when Apple came out with their iPhones and their laptops, they really wanted to make them look super nice and curvy, and This is neat and organized.
And if you open them up, they're like kind of everything is neatly put together in there.
Exactly. And so it definitely made a huge difference. And while the Saturn, in theory, it had two Hitachi SH2 32-bit central processing chips.
So 64 bits.
Yes.
Just kidding. That's not how it works.
That technically should have been more powerful than the PlayStation chip, the RISC chip they had that I mentioned before. But those two Hitachi chips were somewhat inferior to the PlayStation chip. They were a little older, I think, and they didn't add up. And the rumor is that, and this is all rumor, this is in the book, unsubstantiated, that Nakayama chose that Hitachi SH2 32-bit chip as a favor to a golf buddy, and that's why it was in there, which I don't know if that's true. It's in the book. It's definitely like, I'm including it as an aside. I don't think it's whatever you want to believe, but I don't.
That would be the wrong decision.
That would definitely be not a good reason to pick a chip. Yeah. So also programming from the Saturn was difficult. I should say that, where the PlayStation had the dev toolkit they would give to all the developers. Even Yu Suzuki, the guy who designed it, openly admitted to having trouble with the dual processor design while he tried to do a Saturn version of his game Daytona. He's like, I had trouble with it, and I designed the thing, which is not a good sign. So Sega announced, this is coming up to E3, they announced in mid-May that the release of Saturn would take place on September 2nd on a day known as Sega Saturn Saturday. That's
Sega Saturn Day?
Sega Saturn Saturday, yeah. Sega Saturn Day. That's what they should have done. Yeah. It's really, though, they had a surprise waiting for everyone in E3. And that surprise we're going to get to next episode. But that's what Sega's doing. So that's how they're leading into the E3 conference of 1995.
Okay.
Do you want to talk about Nintendo?
Yeah, I just want to take a second to talk about Daytona. That's a great game.
Oh,
It has a great theme song. The theme song is really the best part. I haven't played it that much in the arcade, but you always hear it when you walk by, and arcades that have older ones.
It is a great...
Daytona.
I do love that. I also really like the Sega arcade games.
Yeah.
Like they were talking about Daytona. I remember playing Virtua Racing a lot. And I would play Virtua Fighter on arcades. I was just really bad at... I'm just bad at fighting games, so I don't really play them often.
Yeah, that's tough. All right, so we figured out what's going on at Sega and how they're gearing up for this very first E3. Let's talk about Nintendo. So Nintendo, we're deep in the Super Nintendo era. They're not doing super hot against the Genesis. They're doing fine. They're holding tough, and they're making a profit on every console sold. So, they're doing better than you'd think. But they've got something in the works. So it's as early as 1993, Nintendo was talking plans to release a new console. They had partnered with a company called Silicon Graphics to make a system that they were calling Project Reality. Silicon Graphics is the company that made a lot of early computer-generated graphics hardware. So they're what Rare used to do the Donkey Kong graphics on. Terminator 2 used it. I think Jurassic Park used them as well. We'll probably talk about that in a second. But they were calling it Project Reality. Side note, I love names like this, like Project Reality, in retrospect, looking back to it, because remember back in the day when you're playing your game and it's like, this was the pinnacle of graphics and you're going, wow, it can never get better than this. This is basically real life. And then you hear Nintendo's coming out with another thing. There's something that's supposed to be even better than the Super Nintendo I'm playing games on, and they're calling it Project Reality. It's like, I just love the thought of us back in the day being like, wow, the Ultra 64 Project Reality is going to be real life. We'll never need anything after that. Which of course would turn out.
We won't go any farther than this.
Yeah, it would just turn out to be not true. But anyway, Silicon Graphics, hot off the success of movies like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park that I just mentioned, they had used their hardware to make some pretty cool looking effects. So it's hard to blame someone for thinking that a game console might be able to deliver those kinds of graphics too. So we hadn't spent a lot of time with 3D graphics at this point in time. So saying hey, we partnered with Silicon Graphics. They did the graphics for Terminator and they did the graphics for Jurassic Park. That basically said to us back in the day, holy cow, we're going to get Jurassic Park dinosaurs in our video games.
That would be so cool.
Crazy.
This is a dream of mine. Yeah.
And so this means that Nintendo would be skipping over the 32-bit generation entirely. Well, not entirely. We'll talk about that in a minute. But for home consoles, they were going to go straight from 16-bit to 64-bit. And not like Jaguar 64-bit. I'm talking real 64 bits of gaming power. Trip Hawkins, who is apparently part of the peanut gallery here over at EA, he is a little bit skeptical when they said that they could make a 1995 launch. He's going, nah, they're not going to make that 1995 launch. Howard Lincoln kept saying that it would be out in 1995, but Tripp just said, no, it's not going to be.
I want to note, too, that Trip Hawkins is a total naysayer, but he's really going at people the whole time. He's like really going at people in this whole thing. All the companies are on blast.
Yeah, he's just putting them on blast. So Nintendo was announcing companies like Rare, who hadn't actually released Donkey Kong Country at this point because we're talking like 1993. So Donkey Kong Country wasn't out. They were fairly unknown. They had made like probably the most successful thing they had made to that point was like Battletoads, which people knew about, but it didn't exactly make Rare a household name. They also announced that a company called DMA Designs would be making games for it. DMA Designs would go on to make the Grand Theft Auto series, not on the Nintendo 64. Spoiler alert. So, yeah. The wet blanket on the whole reality announcement was Nintendo's later clarification that the system would continue to use cartridges. This is a world where CD-ROMs were the next big thing. Remember, we had the Sega CD in like 1992, Saturn's on CDs, PlayStation's on CDs, everybody's on CDs. Nintendo, get your act together. It's time to move to CDs. But they were saying, nah, we're going to go back to cartridges, or we're going to keep using cartridges, and that just felt like a real step backwards. Let's recap some of the advantages. CD-ROMs could hold more, so they could have like real music and full motion video and stuff like that. The advantages to cartridges, there were a couple advantages. One was that they were faster, so load times, like Saturn and PlayStation games would have like really long load times before you get into the game. Nintendo 64 didn't really have load times on games if they had them at all. CD-ROMs had a piracy problem, especially on really early consoles when you could just like copy a CD, which, I mean, consumer CD burners weren't really a thing yet until probably the late 90s, early 2000s. But they did exist, and so counterfeit games existed, and CD-ROMs were pretty easy to counterfeit if that's what you wanted to do. So Nintendo had a bit of a piracy advantage by keeping Project Reality on cartridges. It's much harder to pirate a cartridge. It was also cheaper to manufacture the hardware itself, so Project Reality itself would be much cheaper because CD-ROM drives are really expensive to make, or were at least back in the day. The downside to that is cartridges themselves are much more expensive to manufacture. CDs cost like 25 cents to print, probably another couple bucks for the case and all that stuff, ultimately not costing a whole lot to actually make a game, which meant lower margins for game publishers. Cartridges would cost 10, 20 bucks a piece, and that really lowered your margins and didn't allow you to drop prices on games either. So there's also sort of like, this is unconfirmed, but there's speculation that it also allowed Nintendo to retain control over the actual cartridges themselves. So remember how they had to make the cartridges for all the Nintendo and Super Nintendo games? That was part of their deal. They wanted to keep doing that with the Nintendo 64. And so like that allowed them to keep control over that stuff, because anybody can make a CD. Like the technology was out there. It wasn't like you could license it from Philips or Sony and whoever else made the Panasonic, I think, was in on CDs. And so anybody could just make CDs, or any company could make CDs. Howard Lincoln would deny that. He'd be like, nah, that's not true. It was mostly about piracy, and it was mostly about slow load times. But, you know, you can't talk about this subject without like sort of going into that as well. Nintendo is pretty notorious.
There was like a big thing about people like accusing them of that in the book too, being like, oh, you're just trying to make it so you can't use third-party stuff. That's what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Trip Hawkins accused them of that, I think, a lot.
Howard Lincoln would later announce the real name, this is air quotes, real name of Project Reality, the Ultra 64.
That's a cool name.
Yeah, I like it better than Nintendo 64, which, as we all know, is what it ended up being, because it sort of fits the line of like Nintendo things. So they had the Nintendo, and they had the Super Nintendo, and then the next one should be the Ultra Nintendo, because they couldn't do Mega Nintendo, obviously, because Sega had that covered with the Mega Drive, which is the Genesis was known as anywhere that was not America.
That's a really cool name, the Ultra Nintendo.
Yeah, it would make
could be like Star Road, and eventually get to Tubular Nintendo.
Yeah,
that's what I
want.
And
like Super Duper Nintendo, or I don't know.
The Super Duper
I don't know where you keep going in that line. Yeah. I don't know where you go in that line of names, but I love the name Ultra 64. So anyway,
yeah, Ultra 64 is cool.
Yeah. When they showed the press their first glimpses of the system, it was behind closed doors. they showed Killer Instinct, a game that was coming to arcades that they said was running on true, real Ultra 64 hardware, which ended up not really being the case, actually. It was running on some very different hardware, and it ended up not really making the same thing, but that's what they said, and it produced similar results, so I guess we let that slide.
Yeah, I let it slide.
Yeah. So the Ultra 64, we'll get into a little bit of hardware here, had a true 64-bit CPU, but it also had a separate graphics processor that was capable of 100,000 polygons per second, which is fewer polygons per second than the Saturn, I think we discussed earlier, was supposed to be capable of.
And the PlayStation was 350,000.
Oh, yeah,
so.
350. So that's crazy. A lot less, actually, like a third of the polygons per second. But it had a bunch of other features, too, that weren't available on the PlayStation or Saturn, things that sort of smoothed the image out and made it look overall kind of like higher, I don't want to say higher definition, but that's kind of what it is. Like, if you play a PlayStation game and then you play the Nintendo 64 version of that game, there's a very distinct difference you can see in sort of the way things are. It's hard to explain. I'm sure there's like an explanation for it all and like a name for it. But you can definitely tell when something is a PlayStation game or when it is a Nintendo 64 game. And it's not necessarily better or worse, but you can just tell.
Well, also that 64-bit CPU had to really be helping them out a lot in every aspect of the game. Just like
twice
speed.
many bits.
Yeah, menus. It's got to be stronger.
Yeah, that's right. So that's Nintendo 64. I did say earlier we skipped from 16-bit to 64-bit. That was really only on the home console stuff. Let's talk about the Virtual Boy.
Ooh.
So the Virtual Boy, did you ever have a Virtual Boy?
No, I never had one of these. Did you have one?
No, I didn't. I wanted one, but I never got one. I do remember playing it at a store and being like, this is crazy. Anyway, let's talk about that Virtual Boy. So Virtual Boy was a 32-bit system developed by a boy, Gunpei Yokoi. He's the guy who made the Game Boy, and he produced things like Metroid and Kid Icarus. Sadly, died in a car accident in 1997. Rest in peace. So the Virtual Boy was a strange console handheld hybrid thing. It had its own screen and it ran on batteries, but it was like too large to be carried around comfortably. Like, it wasn't really portable, which was kind of strange. The screen was only able to produce red images on a black background, and the idea was that it would use two mirror scanning stereoscopy displays to create the illusion of 3D objects. So you would like put it up against your face like virtual reality things we have today, and it would like show each eye a slightly different image, which would create this illusion of 3D. But it was everything was red and black, and it was like really strange and didn't quite create the effect I think they wanted it to.
Yeah. It seemed really odd.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. You want
Yeah.
to play a little game real quick? A little side game? How much do you think it costs to get a brand new Virtual Boy on eBay?
$100.
Ooh, a brand new?
Oh, brand new, like in box?
In box. Brand new.
$400. $400.
That's really close. $479.06. Ships
Oh,
from Japan. But that's really
Wow.
close.
That's crazy. I bet you like a used one's probably $100. Maybe
Yeah,
two. I guess they're probably a collector's item now.
This used one I found, it has 2 games, the controller and everything. $300 plus $25 shipping. Yeah, that's just a very quick eBay search. So just to keep that in mind, if you guys are looking for a Virtual Boy, I got you covered.
It was super weird. It really just ended up hurting people's eyes and giving people headaches because it like tried to do this 3D thing but didn't do it very well. And it was like, you're not really making games that are cool here. You're just kind of showing off a technology that isn't even that great. What I thought was interesting about it is if you played a Virtual Boy long enough, your eyes would sort of become unable to see the color red. They would get really tired of that color.
Really?
And so when you take the thing off, things would have like anything that's red would have this tinge of like cyan, which in your eyeball is like the opposite of red. So in order to give itself a break from showing you red, it would show you cyan. Your eyes would.
So if you want to permanently screw up your eyes, get a Virtual Boy.
yeah, that effect wasn't. Yeah, that effect wasn't a permanent effect. It was like it lasted for probably like 20 or 30 minutes afterwards. But like it definitely, like when you were done playing Virtual Boy, you were like, oh, wow, I can't see the color red right now. This is crazy.
That's so weird. I wonder how that would work with my like red-green color deficiency, if it would do anything different with me. Because I'm red-green color deficient and I have troubles like differentiating certain shades of red and stuff.
That's a good question.
So I wonder
it sounds
how
like
it
we
would
need
affect
to
with me.
Yeah, sounds like we need to get a Virtual Boy for science. You need to
For science
figure this
sake.
out.
I don't think they
Yeah.
had colorblind assist back then, so
Yeah, well, I mean, everything was either red or black, so I guess it didn't matter as long as you could. I guess, yeah, I mean, you might have trouble with that. That'd be interesting.
I gotta know because I actually need to get better about. So what I do is I forget to turn it on, but if I turn it on when I get a game, it makes things actually legitimately easier.
You're talking about the
Colorblind assist mode. Like if I turned it on with Battlefield 1 relatively early, and it was really helpful. Like it actually did some good. It just changes instead of red for bad guys and green for good guys, it changes it to like a blue usually and a green.
Yeah.
So I think blue is it's different how they do it each game. They change the colors up each game, but it really does help.
Yeah. That's crazy. Yeah, and that's an interesting thing that I don't think about. Yeah. So
I don't think about it either, and then I have trouble seeing the color brown sometimes.
So they could have also used blue or yellow or green displays, but they chose red simply because red LEDs are cheaper. That's it.
Oh, interesting.
So they went with red. Yeah. So they had a choice of a lot of things. They could have gone with full color also, but that would have made the console cost like $500 or more, and they were like, "That's too much." So
in retrospect, maybe they should have though.
Yeah, it might have actually been an okay thing if they had. But the biggest problem with the Virtual Boy was not that it was a 32-bit console in a 64-bit world. It's not that it was virtual reality not great and only showed red for the color. The Virtual Boy had no games.
Has no games.
No games. They had like a Mario Brothers remake. They had a Mario, I think one of the first Mario Tennis games was on there. There's a Wario game, but none of them were really any good. And none of them took advantage of the things that the Virtual Boy could do, which wasn't a whole lot compared to other traditional systems at the time either. But yeah.
Well, I looked at the cartridges in the photo of this eBay page, and they look like Game Boy cartridges. Straight up, just bigger Game Boy cartridges. That gray, like skinny kind of cartridge. It's like an Altoids container size, looks like.
Yeah, it just didn't have any games. So it was bad technology that people didn't want, and it didn't have any games that people wanted to play, so did horribly, didn't sell well. Nintendo just likes to forget about it, even more than they like to forget that the Wii U ever happened.
Oh, I like the Wii U.
Yeah, me too. Big fan. So we're going to go back. The reason we talked about Trip Hawkins earlier is because we're going to bring it back full circle. Trip Hawkins was right.
Whoa.
Yeah, so he was talking a lot of smack, but he backed it up. So when Acclaim, which was one of the early announced partners for the Ultra 64, released their revenue predictions for 1995, they had predictions for the PlayStation, they had predictions for their Saturn sales, they had no predictions for the Ultra 64 sales. So the jig was up at this point, and Nintendo had to announce that the Ultra 64 had been delayed to 1996.
No.
Yeah, and that's where we leave this episode.
Yeah, man. I mean, I'm kind of happy it got delayed to 1996 because that was the first ever console I got as like a present. The first ever new console I ever got was a Nintendo. No, that's not true. Never mind. I got a Sega Genesis, but I don't know if that was new or not. I just remember opening the box for the Nintendo 64 Christmas morning and losing my mind.
Oh, that video is you?
Yeah, that video is me. That video is totally me.
Nintendo 64!
So next episode, we're going to go into this E3 show and talk about it and get into the nitty gritty of the next generation of consoles. But Tyler, what have you been playing?
I have been playing a whole lot of the same stuff that I was playing last week. So more World of Warcraft, item level 338 now, so I'm just about ready to take on some normal mode raids. I've been playing Destiny. I'm about power level 537 now. I did the raid, the new Destiny raid, Last Wish, earlier today, and we passed the first encounter. We did it blind. We didn't know what we were getting into, so we had to figure it out as we were going. We figured it out in probably 15, 20 minutes, and then it was all down to execution, and a lot of us were under-leveled, so we had to take a break to go get a few more levels before coming back and beating the first encounter, which was really cool. It was really fun. Got some good gear. And other than that, I've also been playing Final Fantasy XIV, so still playing 3 MMO games, which is a bad idea, but I'm doing it.
To do.
I'm doing it. I know Final Fantasy is probably my Like that's like my third tier. Like I know I'm not going to progress very quickly. I have nobody relying on me to get to a point where like I can play with them. So I'm just kind of taking it at my own pace when I feel like it and between other games.
So that's like a pretty fun way to play a video game, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's pretty
no
cool.
Pressure.
There is something nice about having a group that you're playing with, like for World of Warcraft or like with Destiny. Like if you have a group you're playing with and you're making progress together and you're working together as a team, like that's very satisfying. And I get that, but it is also very nice to just be able to take something at your own pace too, which is what I'm doing with Final Fantasy. I hope to get to the point where people will want to play with me. Like if I could do some of the like higher end dungeons and raids for Final Fantasy, I think that would be really fun. But right now I just love Final Fantasy games. So it's just really hitting all the right spots for me right now. I'm playing a red mage, just hit level 54 and I love that game.
Well, I actually have some news that's exciting me on the Final Fantasy front. I've been playing a lot of Destiny. I don't want to keep talking about it. Tyler did not raid with me, but that's okay because I was busy and I couldn't make it, and I want him to be my raid Sherpa. I want Tyler to
get you in there.
me.
I can take you through the first encounter. I don't know anything about it.
I like to hear Tyler's guiding voice when I play video games. It makes me feel safe. I feel good. That's what I like. Okay. The big news story that I found out today that I didn't notice is that there's a big amount of Final Fantasy games coming out on Xbox. Did you hear about this?
Yes.
So they're coming out first with the Final Fantasy 15 Pocket Edition, which I don't know what that is.
If you have an Xbox, you should just play the regular Final Fantasy 15. But it was like a cool mobile game, I guess.
Okay, because that's coming out on Xbox first, and then they have something called World of Final Fantasy Maxima.
That game's so fun. I love World of Final Fantasy. I need to finish it.
That comes out on November 6th. And then in 2019, Final Fantasy VII comes to Xbox One. And that's what I'm excited about. I got kind of excited because I thought what they were releasing was actually like all the games on one big thing, but they're doing them one at a time, which I kind of like because it gives me kind of time to play them. So I think I'm going to get Final Fantasy Maxima.
World of Final Fantasy?
Yeah, World of Final Fantasy Maxima. That's what it's called. I think Maxima just means it's the Ultimate Edition.
Yeah, it's like the super cool edition of it.
So I think I'm going to get that, I think, because that's November 6th.
I don't know. How much nostalgia do you have for Final Fantasy in general?
I don't have a lot. I played 8, but what's weird is 8 is one of the ones that's not coming out. It's going from 7 to 9. And I'm wondering if 8 is like some weird deal that they can't release it on Xbox.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I might suggest that you skip World of Final Fantasy until you have played other ones, just because the whole like plot of it is like going through a lot of other Final Fantasy games, and there's like a whole lot of nostalgia trips going on there. And so, I mean, it's still really fun, and you'll probably really enjoy it. So maybe you can ignore me. But
also, I mean, truth be told, I had the sudden realization that in October, I believe at the end of October, Red Dead Redemption 2 comes out.
Oh, yeah.
And that is going to be me for a while, I think. Like I'm just going to dive. I'm not going to get Battlefield 5 right away. I think I'm just going to dive head first into Red Dead and really get into it. But recently, in recent gaming news, the Telltale Games closed, the studio, which is a big time bummer. But I made me realize that I have Wolf Among Us on Xbox as a free game. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm going to pick that up tonight, actually. I was planning on jumping into it tonight because I kind of want to play a Telltale game. I never played one before, and I like stories, so I'm going to play this.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
Yeah, because I realized I needed to diversify my gaming lineup here.
Yeah, that's a good call, especially when you've got like one game you've been playing forever, a game like Destiny, which you can just keep playing forever and ever and ever.
Yeah, I'm realizing I'm like, oh man, I want to make a second character, and I'm like, this is too much. I gotta slow down until I play the raid with Tyler. I need to just slow it down.
Play something else. I think Final Fantasy 10 and 12 are coming to Xbox also, right?
Yeah, it looks like 9 is.
Oh, 9 too.
9, and then Final Fantasy 10 and 10 too.
Oh man, 10 and 10 2 are great.
And then 10, 12. There's no 11. 11's not coming to it.
11's
an MMO,
the
right?
old MMO, yeah. It's actually already on Xbox 360.
Oh. Yeah. Isn't it weird that 14 never came out on Xbox at all?
Yeah, I think there was reasons for it. Like Microsoft didn't want to didn't want to play ball or something, but yeah.
Oh, Microsoft. There's always one company that doesn't want to play ball. But you were telling me earlier this week that finally PlayStation and Sony have agreed to allow crossplay on Fortnite.
Fortnite.
Yeah, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, that's great because I can finally sign into my main Fortnite account on my Switch because I had made like a separate account for the Switch, but I didn't want to play it that much because I didn't really want to like make a lot of progress on Switch. And then it wasn't going to be my main account. But now that I can log in on my PlayStation 4 and my PC and Xbox account on my Switch, that's nice.
That's great. That makes me happy.
More Fortnite.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, that's the longer episode today. 52 minutes. A lot to cover.
Yeah, well, that's okay.
I should say pre-editing. I said that now, and then the audience is going to know I edit stuff out.
Oh, yeah. When it ends up being like 46 minutes instead, they're going to be like, what happened to the other 8 minutes?
Where's that lost 4 minutes? So thank you so much for listening today, though. As always, we are on Twitter. I am at Mecoletta, MECOLETTA. Tyler is at SneakerElf, SNEAKERELPH. Important to note. We have an email called codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. If you rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, I would love you until the end of time. It means the world to us, and it really helps out the show, and it means you're the best, and we thank you for that. Also, just tell your friends about the podcast. That's good, too. That's also, if you don't have time, if you're a busy person and you need to tell someone something or you want to help the show, just tell your friends about us. That means the world.
Yep.
So, and with that, we'll see you next week when we talk about E3 1995.
Oh, boy, that's exciting. See you next week.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
This has been a Podaholics Comedy Network presentation. Podaholics.com